Hello, Houston. We're going to finish up our comments on communication today and then move on into social influence and the various factors that impact that. And so let me jump right onto the screen here because we were right in the middle of using the screen to introduce a couple of different concepts. In talking about nonverbal communication, which is the subject we were in the midst of yesterday or day before when we got interrupted by the previous tape when we got interrupted, it comes in a number of different forms. That is, there are a number of different types of nonverbal communication that exist and can be studied. One of them has to do with kinesics, which has to do with gestures that are used. And gestures themselves come in a couple of different forms. One of the most common ones is what's called an emblem. That's essentially a nonverbal action that is clearly understood by most members of a culture. If we can bring the camera back to me for just a minute, I can give you some examples of those that you'll know immediately what I'm talking about. You do that to somebody, that's telling you one thing. How about this? That's a very different kind of thing. Another is somebody was outside the door looking in. They might have thought I was signaling something different than really what I was illustrating here. This is either a sign for that's good or about that big. It's also used that way. This can also be used to indicate something is good, that's bad. Can I have a ride? I can't hear you. Or that kind of thing is simply squinting to indicate you can't see something. It's not clear to you. So those are basically emblems that you and I use. They're related to, but different from, what are called illustrators, which are essentially nonverbal actions that accompany speech that the gesture duplicates or graphically represents the verbal message. What illustrator, for instance, would you think would be likely to accompany a statement if I were to, or if somebody were to make a statement like, he's a very short man? You can kind of indicate what the, where somebody's hand is going to be in that kind of a case. How about a surgeon who's talking to another surgeon about making an incision? They're very likely to kind of grasp the knife and gesture what they're doing, or even where the cut was made, that kind of thing. So illustrators supplement, but they really don't replace the message. And the result of that is that if you can view the illustrators, but you can't hear the message, you're not going to have a clue what's really going on. So the illustrators really are just that. They're supplementary to the basic message itself. Which leads into another very interesting element of language, and that has to do with what's called paralanguage. Para meaning beside or accessory to. And what we're dealing with here is all of the vocal aspects other than the verbal content of a message. When you say to somebody, he's a very short man, that's the verbal content, but when you gesture it, you're really talking about the other aspects of the vocal aspects of what's going on. There's a difference in paralanguage between thanks a lot, which is a genuine expression of gratitude, as opposed to thanks a lot. That's kind of heavy with sarcasm or disgust. The difference between that's great and that's great is a world of difference in the message that's actually communicated, but it's the paralanguage that's really carrying the intended meaning in that situation. Then we get into at least one other that all of us participate in all the time, and that is proxemics. And that is essentially the studying the spacing between people as a cue to the communication and the interpretation, the interpersonal relationship that exists. How close you and I stand to one another is essentially illustrated by the following kind of a table. And that is, if we look at the distance, it also indicates to us what kind of voice we're going to hear in this particular situation. So in essence, if we're intimate with somebody, we're going to be standing within about 8 or 10 inches of them, and we'll tend to be talking very quietly. That would work with families or lovers. That kind of thing would be the situation where you'd see that. Personal distance is up to about 3 feet apart. Anything beyond the intimate distance, up to about 3 feet apart, would typically involve a soft or low use of language. And in that situation, you would do it with your mate in public or with friends, any casual acquaintance with whom you're walking across campus. You might see such people up to about 3 feet apart, but it's very unlikely it would be any further apart than that in a normal friend-to-friend kind of distancing when walking. The third element is the social distance, which is anything from about a yard up to about 4 yards, up to about 12 feet apart. In that case, you tend to be using a moderate or a full voice. That's the kind of thing you might do at a party where noise levels tend to go up anyway, speaking levels tend to go up anyway. But that could be in either a business or a formal situation where you might be in groups of up to about 10 or 15 people standing around talking. Well, 15 would be the upper limit probably. But in a social situation, it really breaks into a public situation when the distance across the group, when you're trying to talk to somebody directly across from you, means that your voice has to be so loud that you're not quite bellowing, but almost to make yourself heard. And in that case, you really shift over into the fourth distance, which is essentially public distance. And that would be anything from about 3.5 yards out to up to infinity. 3 or 3.5 yards out. 4 and 4.5 is what I should have said there. But in any case, the voice that you use in that case is loud. That's what I'm using now as I'm talking. I mean, I'm not shouting, but in addition to being recorded for your personal viewing in your living room, I'm also talking to people that are about 30, 35 feet away from me in the studio. So my voice tends to be louder than it might otherwise be in this kind of a situation. Which also leads to another rather interesting way. You and I just ooze communication signals all the time in terms of the distancing between ourselves and somebody else we're talking to. That's an establishment. There's an illustrator. That's an establishment of the nature of the social relationships that you two enjoy in that kind of a conversation. It's illustrated by that. But another one that's also involved is kind of more indirect, but it's also important, and that is territoriality. Animals, of course, are known for that, but it's essentially the delineation or defense of an area by anyone, by an animal, by a human. If you're riding in an airplane, nowadays it's harder to do it simply because they usually assign the seats before we get onto the plane at all. But when boarding was kind of first come, first served, what you tend to do is put a marker in the seat beside you. You know, if you're carrying a purse, you'll put it in the seat beside you. If you're carrying magazines or a newspaper or anything like that, you put it in the seat beside you in the hope that as people are coming down the road, particularly in the back where most of us are traveling, where it's 3 seats on each side, you're hoping that somebody will sit in the outer seat, which is fine, but you'd rather not have somebody right next to you, so you're really confined to the 21 inches they give us, or 20, or whatever it actually is. But we use markers to achieve that. Men's urinals are another classic example of that, and that is if you have 3 or more in a row, when you walk into a men's room, you always take one on the extreme, left or right. If anyone else joins you when there are 3 or more urinals, they will always stand at least 1 urinal away from you. There's always a gap between you. And there is a whole series of studies, fascinating to read, that have been done of urinal behavior in terms of standing and social distancing that goes on in that kind of a situation. There's a whole ritual there. But there are others that you and I are equally participating in, and that is things like elevators. There are real rituals that we go through with elevators. For instance, if you're on a crowded elevator, there's no problem with everybody backing up and making as much room as possible, and you may be standing even touching the person next to you in that situation. But as the elevator empties, you know, across the different floors of the elevator, we respace ourselves, we redistribute ourselves. And it would be absolutely bizarre if you had been standing next to somebody who was standing next to the wall and the elevator gradually empties out on each stop, for you to still be standing there with your arm touching their arm. That just wouldn't happen. It would look truly bizarre if you got onto the 7th floor and there are you and that innocent other party standing there elbow to elbow right next to each other in a huge elevator. You'll redistribute the floor space. Each of you takes about half. And it happens very subtly, but it happens. It happens automatically. It's an unwritten rule among many that you and I use in communicating with each other all the time. Skin sensitivity is another one that has a very complex set of rules related to it. Men touch women more often than women touch men, as one example. This may be explained simply by the difference in power status. That's one possibility in most working situations. But cross-sex touching occurs more often than same-sex touching. We tend to touch people of the opposite sex more often than those of the same sex. And cross-sex touching involves a couple of different exceptions. One is members of a sports team. In that case, all of the members, typically of the same sex, because you're normally involved in women's sports or men's sports, will be touching each other, slapping each other on the back, congratulating one another, and so forth. But there's no other difference among the sexes, between the sexes, in same-sex touching. Contrary to the popular belief that women touch more often than men, Not true. We both touch more or less equally in that respect in terms of frequency. There are enough held rules, there are enough strongly held rules as to where same-sex and opposite-sex pairs can touch one another, and they're quite rigidly held. Touching down, which sounds obscene, but I'm actually talking about it in the social sense, is much more likely to occur than touching up. What that means is essentially if you've had a problem at work, the boss is more likely to come over and put his arm around your shoulder to talk through the situation than it is that if you've got a problem with a coworker so that you need to go to the boss, you're not likely to walk up to him or her, throw your arm around his or her shoulders and say, we've got a problem, we need to talk. Okay, that would be touching up in a social situation, and that very seldom happens. Other ways that we communicate, one would involve, for instance, mutual gaze. Eye contact really reflects attentiveness. If you've got high attentiveness to somebody, you will maintain a lot of eye contact. If you have low attentiveness, you're disinterested in them, you will not tend to look at them while they're talking as much. Eye contact really communicates intensity of feeling, not positive or negative aspects of feeling, because in some cases you'll stare at people whom you particularly don't like. In terms of interpersonal attraction, mutual gaze is definitely an indicator of positive effect. Couples in love will tend to gaze at each other much more than those with lower levels or no emotional linkage between them at all. Interpersonal rejection can also be done or achieved by stares. A steady gaze essentially becomes a stare, and a stare becomes essentially an insult. If you simply stand staring at someone for a long period of time with that kind of look on your face, you're essentially communicating the animus that you feel toward them in that given situation. And as I said, there are sex differences that exist, that females tend to maintain more eye contact than males do. And in fact, we can illustrate that in the following kind of a graph. That is, in a situation where females are, or where we're listening, what happens is that females tend to maintain more eye contact in terms of percentage of time than do males in a listening situation, but it also turns out to be true in a speaking situation. In both cases, females have a significant gain difference of perhaps 10% or more in terms of the increased time of actually maintaining eye contact during a spoken conversation. But there are other ways in which we ooze various kinds of communication, and that would include things like body posture. For instance, if you were about to proposition somebody in the library, you would be much more likely to approach the person on the left than the one on the right, simply because the one on the right exhibits what is called a crossed legs in the open position. That is, it's an open cross, whereas a closed cross would be where the two legs are hooked right across each other. It's almost knee to knee, although the legs happen to be crossed. That is not as an approachable a position as the open cross would suggest. You'll notice also that the one on the left of the two that are sitting here is exhibiting several different cues about not being approachable. He's not looking up, he's not looking at you. He's got legs in the more closed position, as near as I can see. In fact, what he's got is his arms crossed across his knees. That's a kind of another way to close yourself in and say, basically, I'm not approachable in that kind of a situation. The maximum approachable situation is sitting without your legs crossed and your hands at your sides or on your knees or something like that. That's really exuding messaging to other people that, yes, I'm approachable, I'm not nervous about anything, let's get on with talking and so forth. If you lean back or cross your arms, that's a sign that you simply dislike somebody or you're disinterested in what they're basically saying. At an interview, typically the interviewee will sit forward, not back. On the other hand, the interviewer, the one who's conducting the interview, will tend to sit back and be relaxed in their posture. They're much less tied into what's going on, whereas the interviewee is right up on the edge of their seat to be responsive and look attentive and so forth. It's just in the nature of the role of the interviewee. And if we can look at one more illustration, we see another one, and that has to do with the closed arms situation, which is another way to illustrate, don't get near me. She also is not looking at you, another sign that she's not interested in talking to you. So there are a couple of different cues just in that posture that say, stay away from me. I'm not interested, for whatever reason, I'm not interested in talking to you at this point. And if we look at the eyes, that's a little harder to see, but let me show you the other situation here. The one on the upper side, it's unfortunate there's a sex difference here, first of all, and secondly, there's a slight difference in the directness of the lighting. But the person on the left has more beady eyes. And if both were photographed in the more relaxed light that you see on the right photograph, and the eyes of the person on the upper left were that small, that would be indicating essentially disinterest again. As we gain interest in somebody, as somebody approaches us whom we like, our eyes tend to open up. We are powerless to control it. It's one of those unconscious things that we signal to people. So if you've had friends that are good at getting dates with people, one of the things they're probably very good at is judging people's diameter, the diameter of their pupil when they approach them. When that friend approaches them, if they're good at reading those eyes, they can go a long way toward advancing their social life with that kind of knowledge. And there are also sorts of other facial expressions that can be manifested. Paul Ekman, out at the University of California, San Francisco, published an interesting book back in 1992 in which he looked at or identified 6 universal emotions which can be expressed by facial clues, one of which is anger, another of which is disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. All of these cause universal reactions on the part of our faces, what happens, and the emotions are recognized worldwide. It's independent of culture. Those 6 emotions tend to be conveyed predominantly by the face itself. Cultures do differ in how various emotions are expressed, but those 6 basic ones tend to be very predictable in the format that they will use or in which they'll be expressed in a given situation. So at this point then, let's jump ahead and get into the next section having to do with interpersonal influence. And studying groups is a rather interesting process. A group is not just several individuals considered together or clustered together. It is rather several different things that are going on. When you look at groups, it's kind of like studying water. And in studying of water, it's important to recognize that there are 2 different things that are combined there. One is hydrogen, the other, of course, is oxygen. And those behave individually in particular ways, predictable ways. When you put them together and end up with water, you get a very different kind of substance and a very different set of reactions. And it's a subtle parallel, but I'm suggesting that groups are essentially the same way. It helps to understand the individual members in a group as to what's going to go on socially in the group. But a group is different from the sum of the individuals composing it. That is, there are things that are yielded out of the interactions that go on between individual members that will significantly alter what you get out of a group in watching the interactions there. And so we're going to define a group in a couple of different ways. One is to define it simply as 2 or more persons who interact in a face-to-face relationship. Now, modern technology is, I think, expanding that definition a little bit, if you think about it. You may, in fact, be in a group situation where you're on a computer-based discussion group or something like that. You join into the group. And yeah, there are certain rules about not interrupting what's going on and generally fitting in with the flow and so forth. But the face-to-face is not quite so crucial as is the interaction itself, which is the main semblance of or feature of a group. The members of a group will tend to identify with that group. That's the reason, for instance, that sorority and fraternity members will tend to wear pins or caps with particular logos on them. You and I, as members of the University of Houston, will tend, that's a much bigger group, but in essence, we'll walk around town with U of H sweatshirts on as a marker, as an identifier of that's the group that we identify with. You wouldn't be likely to see a Rice student, unless a very tolerant one, walking around with a U of H sweatshirt. It's simply, that's one of the markers that you and I may use in a given situation. We can also define it in another way, and that is simply an aggregation of 2 or more people who are to some degree in dynamic interaction with one another. That key of dynamism and interaction is central to both different types of definitions in that situation. In a group situation, generally, there are at least 4 factors which are critical to the operation of the group itself. One is there has to be interaction and communication. This is reflected in the original definition by the phrase face-to-face relationship. But as I said, technology in some cases, I'm thinking about when NASA sends somebody around the world. That's a worldwide interaction that's going on, but it's still a fairly narrow cluster of NASA employees who are acting as a group in communicating with each other to keep track of what's going on the mission itself. So that interaction principle is still definitely there. Face-to-face is maybe a little less necessary than it was at one time. Secondly, the group members feel that they belong together. For instance, in a family, that would be one example of a group, but there's a clear reason why you're in that particular group. Direct communication certainly facilitates a group. It's the reason fraternities and sororities have meetings, weekly, monthly, whatever. It is to establish and maintain the cohesion within the group. What's the common goal that we have, and where are we headed? How are we going to get there? Members of a group will tend to respond uniquely to other people in the same group. I mean, if a husband and wife pass each other in a hallway, they will respond. They may hug each other. There are a lot of different ways in which they will indicate that there's a lot more intense relationship between them than any two members of a university class who happen to pass each other in the hallway and recognize that both are in this, that, or the other class. And the result is that what that group often does is to become what is called a reference group, and that is a group has a certain number of features to it by which you can claim ownership. That is, you can, same example, fraternity or sorority sweatshirt is a way in which that group has a unique logo that they're utilizing, and in fact you put it on simply to declare yourself as a member of that group. So you're identifying with the reference group when you're using named products on your body as a shirt or something like that. A third thing, and we've talked around it already, but that is that groups tend to have common goals. The interdependence of different people in a given group really implies that these goals exist. There are shared goals, which is one of the main reasons why you belong to a given group. If an individual no longer identifies with a group's goals, what will typically happen is that they will back away. They will not be as intensely involved in group activities. They will tend to start missing meetings and things like that. And the final thing then that's also been talked about in various ways is that communication is also going on. The interaction in a group will typically follow some sort of a structure. That's the reason, for instance, that sororities and fraternities elect presidents. That's the person who's expected to actually lead the meeting anytime the group gets together. And it also implies a certain number of norms and roles governing the interaction of a given group. The president, for instance, might turn to another member who is treasurer of the group and ask for a report at some point about chapter finances. That would be an example of a communication. The interaction is going on between the treasurer and the group as a whole, but it's suggesting the idea of designating in various ways is suggesting that there may be some difference in the power, your power within a group as a function of which particular role you happen to be serving in the group situation itself. Let's also then look at another set of factors that have to do with let me see if I can get this thing to go in the common direction. Common goals we've talked about, communication we've talked about, that's what I was expecting. And that is that when we have groups, they tend to exist for one of two reasons. Now that's broadly oversimplified, but in general, if you think about all the groups that you belong to, they tend to exist for one of two sets of reasons. Either there is a task orientation, something that pulls the group together, or a social function. And in that case, of course, both groups can be served by any given group. The goals of both groups can be served by any one group. But groups usually tend to form around either the task function or the idea that let's get together and have a party, or let's be a social group. And in turn, another way to illustrate that is that in a group situation, there tends to be a certain amount of sex role stereotyping that goes on there, like in anything else that we humans get involved in. Males, for instance, tend to perform the task functions in mixed-sex groups. When there's a mixed-sex combination in the group, the task functions will tend to be monitored and responded to, conducted primarily by the males, where the females are more often performing the socio-emotional functions in mixed-sex groups. They're the ones that plan the parties for Christmas time and so forth. Male groups tend to do task functions best. Female groups tend to do social emotional functions best. So there is sexual specialization that goes on there. Number of different tasks could be suggested as examples in any given group. If you think about, pick a group that you belong to right now and think about who is the information seeker. The new members in a group may be asking more questions about why are we doing this, what are we going to do, and so forth, how's it organized. You may have a leader who is an opinion seeker, or on the other hand, a member may be seeking to achieve unanimity in the group, and what he or she is doing is seeking particular opinions. In other cases, you'll have elaborators in a group. They will take a particular concept and they'll think about the implications of it, what's likely to fall out if we make this as a rule in terms of getting new members and whether they'll likely participate and so forth. There may be coordinator roles. That could be something like a social chairman, for instance, who's the one that plans the parties, whether it's a social group or a task-oriented group. The orienter is the one that's keeping the group more or less headed in a given direction, one of the major reasons why it was organized to begin with. There may be somebody who serves an evaluation function, a critical function in the group itself. If the members begin to sense that they're not achieving what they really were intended to get together for, that will generally be vocalized by somebody. And another role that we could talk about is essentially the energizer, the one who creates the enthusiasm within a group for getting a task done. But those are generally task-oriented kind of situations. On the other hand, we have social emotional tasks, and you can see this operate in any given group. Certain people will tend to take a task orientation, others will tend to take a social orientation. People who are providing encouragement for the group as a whole are facilitators of the social ambiance or environment in a given group. People who are seeking harmony, you get two members disagreeing with each other, and somebody is going to step in and try to get them to understand the basis for the disagreement and bring them back toward wherever the group happens to be headed. That's a harmonizing function. Another way in which that can be performed socially is by compromise. You want this, she wants that. Can we do it this way, which will kind of respond to some of your needs, some of your needs. That would be compromise as a social function within the group to keep it functioning and to achieve the goals for the group. There is, of course, a gatekeeper, somebody who determines whether you can or can't, should or shouldn't be in a particular group. Meetings at the University of Houston, being a state institution, are open by state law. Meetings here at the U of H are open. But I can imagine there are certain kinds of groups that meet here under the rubric of the University of Houston, under the aegis of the University of Houston, and you'd get kind of funny looks if you actually walked into one of their meetings. So there's the legal necessity, but then on the other hand, somebody normally in a group will serve as a gatekeeper. That may even be a subtle role, like introducing somebody who's come in for the first time, kind of implying that you're here by virtue of my or the group's position. The standard setter is another function that's social, essentially, to make sure that the group has an understood goal for itself in one way or another. There may be people who observe the social processes in the group. The member who sat there quietly until an argument gets started and then jumps in with something really on target, like you two seem to be disagreeing with each other. Well, it's kind of subtle in one way, but it is important to get people to recognize there is a disagreement and some need to get it solved for the purposes of the group as a whole. And then on the other hand, there are others that sit in the back of a room very quietly and simply go along with whatever you like. Those are the followers. Those are the ones that are being led in some way by the group. Let me give you some examples of clusters of individuals and let you decide whether or not they are groups. So for instance, if we looked at all the members of a protest march downtown, would that be considered a group? Would that qualify as a group? Well, I'll give you the answer. Yes, that would be considered a group for a couple of different reasons. A, each of them has decided actively to be there. That is, it's by each individual's decision that they have decided to be there and participate in the situation. There's also the fact that in this case it's not T-shirts but markers. They're carrying signs protesting or advocating for this, that, or the other kind of a situation. And so those are markers of the idea that all the members in a protest march are an example of a group with a common goal and a reason why each of them is there. How about the workers at a construction site? Would that qualify as a group? And I would argue again, yes, because there's a common goal, and that is to build the building, get the pay, and get out of town before it collapses. So there are a whole series of efforts that are involved in that case. How about all the persons waiting at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to switch? With that, I mean, there is a common goal, getting across the street without getting broadsided by a bus. But in fact, that's about the limit of it. Other than the instantaneous, I need to get across the street and I can't do it till the walk sign changes, there's really nothing else that has everybody there together. So that would be considered a gathering, but not a group per se. So that's not a group. How about the people riding on an elevator? Would that be considered a group? And I would argue, probably not. It's not a group. You all happen to be there, but it's because each of you needs to get somewhere up in the library. Okay, and it's easier to ride the elevator in the tower than it is to walk, assuming you've got to go a significant way. If you're going up to one of the top floors, you're of course going to ride the elevator. But each of you is there with a particular book and a particular floor in mind, having nothing to do in common with why you're on the elevator, other than the fact that all of you need to get up there with minimum effort. But what happens if it gets stuck? If for whatever reason the elevator, the door is shut and the thing starts and then you hear a grinding sound and it stops. Now all of a sudden things begin to change because somebody assumes responsibility for taking out the emergency phone and calling help. Somebody is checking the emergency exit to see whether the door can be jimmied open so you can, not gracefully, but maybe you're 2 feet above the floor, you can still get out if you can get the door open. Somebody else may be serving to, well, let's just calm down. I mean, we'll be here a while, but they'll figure out how to get us out of here. And there may be others who are offering help in actually exiting. Somebody is putting their hands down in the form of a step so that you can have something to step into as you're getting out. So in that case, when it gets stuck, you're going to have a group that forms instantly. I mean, there is a common bond there, maybe no goal that you have other than saving your life in the worst situation. But it will function as a group in that kind of a situation because you all face a common problem. The elevator's stuck. You're not able to get out immediately. And then you see a lot of the attributes of a group among the people on an elevator who happen to be stuck on the elevator there. What about all the people who are watching this lecture, this program? On when it's done on the internet or something like that. In one broad sense, they might be considered a group. All of you are sending homework into a particular place or papers for approval and so forth. But beyond that, it would be really a stretch to say that individual members of the class function as a group, because really we don't. The very nature of television is that we tend to view the lecture in many different, maybe 100 different places around the city for any given lecture, and that's simply not a group function. And in that case then, such collections of individuals are generally labeled as aggregates. They're people who have a particular reason for being in a given place. You know, you're enrolled in the class or something like that, but there's no need to share with other members of the group except of the aggregate, except where you need to know what the homework is or when it's due or something like that, if that becomes a need. So then the question is, well then, okay, so why do all these groups exist? And there turn out to be a lot of different reasons for that, one of which is essentially having to do with what some have argued is a learned need to affiliate or belong. Maslow, in his hierarchy of needs, actually refers to this as a need for belongingness. That's his third level of clustering factors in creating groups in his listen to me, in his assessment of needs, his rank ordering of needs from most basic to most sophisticated. And the need for belongingness is more basic than the need for if you think back to Maslow's hierarchy, number 3 has to do with the need for belongingness, but number 4 is the one where you start looking for and seeking individual achievement, recognition of your role in the group. And that's a more sophisticated, less basic need. So the very idea that we need to belong is lower on his Maslow's hierarchy than is the need to be individually recognized in a group for whatever we happen to be doing in that case. Another way in which we belong, another reason we belong to groups is essentially because of the information that it provides. Okay? The information is a good idea. Can be shared among group members at any given time, and it may benefit every member. Somebody may discover a new way to check out books more rapidly or anything like that, and sharing it with the group ultimately benefits all. The light bulb itself is an example of shared information. It was a technique that was developed 100 years ago and 150 years ago and has been standardized and passed around. We all tend to benefit from it now. Sports teams share information. It's one of the things that keeps the group together in terms of why we root for the Texans or whoever we happen to pick as a favorite team. Another thing, and this may not seem immediately obvious to you, but in some cases, groups offer many different kinds of rewards just by their very existence as a group. Within a department of psychology, as one example of a bigger group, things like promotion and status, who's an assistant, who's an associate professor, and so forth and so on, are basically determined by the group itself. A certain amount of work earns you the right to be reviewed for the next higher position in the group. Ultimately, the groups are ones that typically define, at least in university environments, the group itself tends to define things like the amount of pay that you're going to get. It's normally a committee decision as to who gets the biggest pay, who gets the least raise, and so forth and so on. But that's really a feature of the group itself, where in other cases, things like officer positions within a group, who becomes president or director of a group, is partly a function. It's a reward offered strictly by the group itself. Once you're leading it, you may not think of it as an honor because there's so much work that goes into keeping a group headed in the same direction with more or less the same set of plans. But that is a feature that groups can offer, is the rewards that membership in the group. Members of a sailing club, for instance, would be another example of those who have the right to launch their boat on a given ramp, to tie their boat up in a sheltered area, and so forth and so on. Those are the kind of rewards that belonging to a sailing club or a boating club would reflect, you would earn as a member of the club. It also turns out that in some situations, being a member of a group is actually important to achieving the goals of the group. When you're playing a football game, you have 11 people on the field at any given time, and that's really necessary. Anything less than 11, and you're not likely to be successful. The only team I know of that actually violates that in some way is soccer. Soccer has penalties, which in some cases are assessed by sitting a member down. If you sin in some egregious way and you get caught, you may be timed out off the field for a minute and a half, 2 minutes. I've never seen a study of it, but I'll bet you that scoring by the opposition is higher when a member is sitting in the penalty box. I don't know, but I simply assume that you have to have an X number of players to play the game effectively, and to the extent you have less than the number you need, you have less ability to defend your own goal and less ability to disrupt whatever the opposition is trying to do. So achievement of the goals can certainly be very important in group membership. Another is self-validation, and that has to do with the idea sorry, I jumped one ahead of myself here. Defense, security, and power is another thing that groups will typically generate. Under some conditions, even for humans, there is strength in numbers. And you can even sense that here on campus, where you, if you're walking across campus, I mean, any place in Houston after dark can potentially be dangerous. I mean, it isn't likely. Most places are pretty well lit and so forth. But on campus here at night, it just makes common sense if you're walking someplace to have a compatriot with you, have a friend. There's strength in being two people rather than one. It decreases the likelihood that you'll get into any kind of trouble. And the police themselves on campus here offer, as a security measure, to come escort you anywhere you want to go. If after hours you can call and get an escort. I mean, at dark, essentially, you can get an escort from a classroom or the library to your car, wherever that happens to be located. And that's a defensive function of a group. But in general, it comes back to there's safety in numbers. And finally, then, the one that I started to say a minute ago is self-validation. Social comparison theory argues that we compare ourselves to others in order to gain insight into our own feelings and our behavior. This exchange of information when we analyze others in a particular group situation validates our own existence, our own reason for existing, and the fact that, gee, others seem to think this particular party, this group is important. And in one way, it serves as validation for our own existence and the efforts that we participate in. And in turn, groups offer a number of different advantages, given that groups do in fact exist. An obvious question to ask concerns the benefits that are gained by a group versus individual performance, and there are many that could be cited. One of them has to do with the judgments that you make in a given situation. Group judgments in general tend to be better than the average of the same number of individuals who's made a particular decision about what to do. But they're not as good as the best individual's assessment. Now that really gets at the heart of why groups exist. Let me just mention that to you again, and that is what I'm arguing here is that judgments by groups are better than the average of the same number of individuals, but not as good as the best individual's judgment in a given situation. And that is that the group in general will tend to enlighten fellow members and reach a better average decision as a group than would the collection of people if they sat in an isolated booth and simply voted on what was to be done in a given situation without interacting with each other. In problem solving itself, there's another way to point out the fact that one person who can solve, say, 3 problems in an hour, so it takes 20 minutes a problem, will find that if he or she joins 2 other people, so you've got 3 people now working on the problems, the group as a whole may be able to solve 6 problems during the course of an hour. So there's a benefit there, but the benefit per individual is cost. That is, when you have a group situation, one of the costs in operating it is the fact that you interact with each other. You have to achieve and maintain organization within a group, and that is at some cost to productivity. So if you've got problems where a person typically can solve it in about 20 minutes apiece, so an hour's worth of work, with a group, if it takes them an hour to solve 6 problems, it still is at cost. That is, the group 3 working individually could have solved 9 problems in an hour. And so the interaction thereby demonstrated, in some cases, detracts from group efficiency. There are also some reasons for differences among different members in a given group, one of which includes the differences in group efficiency, I should say. And that is the fact that if you're pooling and coordinating resources, it will tend to increase the ability to solve a given problem simply because you have more intellectual resources available to yourself. A large number of people increases the likelihood that someone is going to know what is required to solve whatever problem the group is facing. There's an interesting problem in that, and that is that any high school teacher or college teacher worth his or her salt knows that that's true. As class size increases, so does the likelihood that any one student will have the answer to the particular subject that you're addressing or problem that you're addressing. But it goes even further, because in some cases, particularly at a school as broadly enrolled in as the University of Houston, there are times when the student will know more on any selected subject than the instructor. It is simply the case that each of our own unique experiences is so varied that in some cases any one of us may have achieved through effort or accident, whatever, additional knowledge about a subject way beyond what the teacher, him or herself, may be able to offer. So the large number of people in a group, an increasing number, assumes a greater likelihood of finding the answer. The one difficulty with that is that there's an upper limit to that benefit. And that comes back to that issue I was talking about earlier, and that is the efficiency. In a given group, it is helpful, it's necessary, the bigger the group gets, to organize it more. You have to spend more time developing rules of communication, laying out how they're to be operated, and so forth and so on. The University of Houston, our department, for instance, in psychology with 38 faculty members, has what is called a listserv, and that's simply an electronic list where a message can be sent out from one site. It can be sent to everybody in the department who needs it, whether it's the graduate students, the faculty, the staff that supports the work of the department, whatever. But that's an example of something that has to be developed the bigger a department gets. When you've got a department of 2, one talks to the other and the message is relayed. But when the chair is trying to talk to 35 or 40 individuals, it takes a lot more formal communication effort in that situation. A third thing about group discussions in general is that the ideas offered in a group in general are analyzed more before they're offered. And what that has to do with is the fact that anybody who's speaking out in a group tends to think a little bit about what they're going to offer and how it fits in with the general efforts of the group itself, lest you appear stupid by making a comment that has simply not been thought through well, or that others have already thought about and dispensed for whatever reason. But if you just blurt it out, you then may then get heaped on with kind of put down comments about, well, did you consider the impact on thus and so whatever. So normally, ideas that are offered to a group tend to be better than those that are offered by individuals working alone, even if they're contributing to a common pool. And the group situation is important in getting us to analyze our own ideas a little more closely in that situation. The groups also offer a very interesting, pure social psychological effect, and that is basically a synergistic effect. What's meant by that is that each idea may stimulate thoughts among others in the group that you're participating in. The University of Houston, a number of years ago, used to have what was called a Houston Symposium, not the university, the department, our Department of Psychology, sponsored for 4 or 5 years a Houston Symposium. And in fact, we had, at that time, we had money for outside speakers. And what we decided to do was to combine, we pooled the funds and invited 6 people to talk on a given topic. And so what we got was not only 6 very high-quality 1-hour presentations, as you'd get anytime you invite a well-known outside extra-university guest, but what we also got was the group discussions that went on between the people. And there were several instances where you could think about it as you looked at the progression of ideas afterwards, where somebody's idea had stimulated somebody else to propose something that in fact maybe a third person had invigorated a third person. So there is a very definite enlivening effect, a synergistic effect, when you put people together with common skills and turn them loose on a given idea. The group process, interestingly, is typically self-correcting. Errors are corrected. And if you don't think so, try to mount or defend a faulty argument in a given class. What you'll find is that if the instructor allows the discussion to go on, in general, other students will raise counter-arguments to what you're proposing and essentially try to show you why your idea is simply not correct. And in that sense, a group process is self-correcting in the discussions that are going on. Number of different sources contribute to the formation of a group. One book notes a rather interesting quote: "Each of us is born alone and dies alone." I'm not quite, as I thought about that, I'm not really quite sure whether that's correct. I mean, I know at one level what the author is saying, but if you think about it, a birth involves certainly your mother, you, probably a doctor, 1 or more nurses, and in an enlightened hospital, maybe even the father. So a birth is really not a solo process. And in the same way, death is usually not a solo event. We may have an accident all alone, or we may in fact die in our sleep or something, more or less intellectually all alone. But in fact, of course, what happens with death is then there's the rush of the entire family to get to the announced funeral services. So it ends up becoming a collective experience. Even Robinson Crusoe, locked on an island, still had his man Friday. So I'm going to argue that this is some of the elements that offer pressure for group formation in this case. There's some argument that there may be hereditary pressures to form groups. And Harry Harlow did some really instructive studies on macaque monkeys about, it's been 45, 50 years ago now. 1965 was the latest study, 40, I guess. 50. Whatever. What he did was to expand from his initial work on what he initially set up to do was study mother love among chimps. And that broadened into the study of other monkeys and the relationship that would occur. One of the things that he discovered was that when 2 chimps of similar age and maturation are locked in a cage where one of them is caged, and the other one has a way to hit a lever or learn to move something to release the other chimp, they will do it. They will steadfastly work on it as soon as they come to grasp the idea that one is trapped and I can be with him or he can be with me. The second monkey, the one that has the ability to release the other monkey, will work assiduously to find a solution, some way to release that monkey. That would be arguing in favor of the idea that group is a kind of a natural state in that situation. In other studies that Harlow did, what he did was to raise rhesus monkeys in isolation. And what happened was that when he showed an isolated rhesus monkey a picture of an infant, it very clearly, that trapped rhesus monkey very clearly manifested pleasure. She was very happy to see pictures of a fellow being like that particular monkey. If you show pictures of threatening rhesus monkeys, you then tend to get expressions of emotion and distress among the trapped monkey in that situation. So that would be arguing that there are hereditary factors involved in the formation of groups or shying away from them. But there also are environmental factors that we could mention here. Many basic group responsibilities are learned, essentially, and that leads into a general process called socialization, which is simply a social learning process through which an infant, typically, is trained in the attitudes, the beliefs, and the behaviors that are appropriate for a given culture. We all go through that as we're raised. We learn what's appropriate to do, when it's appropriate to do it, and so forth. And in fact, in defining what we mean by culture, what we're really talking about is the customs and traditions of a people, a nation, a group, a cluster. The attitudes and beliefs that are deemed important by these people, whether it be a village in the middle of Africa or a city as sophisticated as New York. Those cultural norms tend to be created. Certain universal problems exist for all groups, all cultural groups. Things like teaching children, that's a responsibility we all share, regardless of where we're created and grow in the world. Caring for children is a second responsibility that older members of any group have. The need to find food and shelter, for that matter. Name just 3 or 4 of the things that are just universally true when we humans get together. It comes with the idea of being human in that case. Culture influences the person in a massive and pervasive way and thus makes for the stability of a society and the continuity of its culture. The person also influences his or her culture and thus makes for the social change. That's a quote from an old social psych textbook, but I think it kind of wraps together the individual roles that we play, but the importance of the society as a whole. And in terms of that, then, let's look at some of the things that are implied by that. Whoops, I forgot to give you that definition. I've already read it to you, but essentially the customs and traditions of people, the attitudes and beliefs deemed important by these people. And those are individually supported, they're collectively supported, and it is from that we define our culture. But in turn, what those cultures lead to is certain kinds of norms, and the norms in general tend to follow one of 2 types of format. In one case, we have essentially these are standards of behavior, if you want to think about it. But an explicit norm is one where the public is agreed upon it. Okay, in a meeting, a group may sometimes vote to suspend the rules. But if they're catering to the normal rules that are used in a meeting, I'm blocking on the name at the moment, but a group can decide for the importance of a discussion that they really want to just get into a free-for-all, let people speak freely, because it's one of those synergistic effects where the topic is important enough to the members that they want to suspend the rules so you don't have to be formally recognized by the chair and just let members talk directly to members, key in other members, and so forth. So the rules themselves by which meetings are conducted and the organization's bylaws are examples of explicit norms. They're stated for everyone to be able to see in a given situation. On the other hand, we also have implicit norms. Those are ones that we all agree on and we carry them around, but they're never actually publicly discussed. Give you 2 good examples just right off the top of my head here. One is cutting in line. If you walk into any of the cafeterias around the campus here at lunchtime, it's just not that you're going to cut in line. You may, but you will take some abuse from everybody behind you, as in, hey, or what's that? The end is over here, and they're gesturing you to the back of the line. Have you ever tried to ask somebody for a seat for their seat on a bus? That's another thing where the role of bus sitter is not likely to be altered by somebody who walks in. Now, there are exceptions to that. If a truly older person or a disabled person asks for a seat, everybody will give way for that kind of situation. But normally, ownership is a right of possession. When you're sitting in it, it's your seat, and people are not going to ask you to move just because you're in that seat in a given situation. And norms and roles basically provide structure for a given group. The role is essentially the behavior that we expect in a given situation. But it's an early step in forming a group is basically to establish those norms and the roles the rules and the roles that the group is going to offer and expect people to exhibit. And if you join a group, individuals really are expected to follow the norms and perform their roles. I'm thinking about cheerleaders as a group. You know, the U of H has a set of male and female cheerleaders. If a woman joins the cheerleading squad, she would not show up in slacks for a game. I mean, there's a standard outfit that the U of H cheerleaders wear in any game-like situation, and that would just be an expectation. It's part of the role of being cheerleader, and that would be but one example. And the result would be that if one member joined the cheerleading squad, regardless of how good he or she was in leading yells, if they're not dressed in the uniform, ultimately the group is very likely to reject them, because there's an effect that you're looking for. I've not organized cheerleader squads, but there is an effect that they're generally looking for in terms of looks, in terms of enthusiasm, in terms of getting the crowd fired up at any given athletic contest and so forth. If you're not willing to participate in that, it would be kind of dumb to join cheerleaders and then stand with your thumb in your ear during the course of a squad doing a cheer or something like that. So the norms and roles are very important in the way in which you and I express ownership or belongingness to a given group. And in turn, it leads to another factor that both norms and roles provide structure for a group, and one of the benefits that comes out of that is cohesion. I really didn't like Lord of the Flies when I initially read it, but it's a very disturbing book when you get into it and consider all of its implications. But I came to really appreciate what was involved when it was assigned reading for me. But in essence, if you remember that story, a group of kids in a kind of an ill-defined way end up crashing a plane or being part of the survivors of a plane crash. And there are enough of them that some form of organization is really going to be necessary. And a character by the name of Ralph actually stepped forward and appointed another one named Jack to head a small hunter group, which was going to go find food for the 20 or so who were isolated on the island there, deserted on the island. And eventually what happened was that Jack's group hunted down and successfully killed a pig. And as the group, they took it upon themselves as a group. They made a group decision to simply roast the pig and consume it themselves. So ultimately that group became the more powerful one because it had the commodity that group needed, the overall island survivors needed, which was food. And the net result was that Jack's group eventually grew and Ralph's group shrank. It lost its cohesion. There was nothing pulling it together because the other group had the resources in that situation. So when we talk about cohesion, what we're really talking about is a force that literally binds a group together. The degree of attraction that a given member feels toward a group is an example of the cohesiveness of the group itself. Factors that positively impact group cohesion would include things like how difficult it is to join a group. The more difficult it is, the more desirable some groups become, simply because it's so hard to get in. You must be some kind of a quality individual, you're thinking to yourself, if they let me in. So the highness of standards in some cases will impact the cohesiveness of the group itself. If a group faces external threats or competition, that was essentially an element of what was going on in the Lord of the Flies, was the competition ultimately between Jack's group and Ralph's group. One of the things that encourages, if you think about it in the state of Texas here, one of the things that encourages and helps maintain UT and Texas A&M as major educational forces in the state is they both have each other. That is, there's a reason for an A&M grad to be very enthused about his school, particularly in opposition to UT Austin at football games or things like that. And UT, same idea, different school, but each has the other, and to a certain extent that lends cohesion to the individual groups in and of themselves. A history of success in a group will tend to in the unique situation that the group has formed, will tend to foster maintaining the group itself. In addition, the smaller a group gets, combined with things like rigid joining criteria, the more cohesive the group will tend to be. Once we turn this group loose and start letting it operate, we then head into certain kinds of problems that become rather interesting in the effects that they can have in this kind of a situation. In terms of the well, in fact, I've already talked about the factors. I just finished talking about the factors that improve cohesion, but groupthink is an illustration of one of the many ways in which groups can be vulnerable as a social institution. And groupthink is a title that was attached to, I'll give you the history of it here in a minute, but essentially groupthink is defined simply as a multi-person decision-making process that yields an unrealistic or excessively rigid group opinion or appraisal in a given situation. Okay? And the net result in that situation is groupthink. That's what it's labeled as. Irving Janis was the first one to identify this back in the early 1970s, and in that definition, he was basically trying. What really set this off originally was the fact that the cabinet of President John F. Kennedy made a decision to invade Cuba. Cuba as a nation had recently been established off the shores of the U.S., and Kennedy, as kind of the penultimate capitalist, was very offended by the very existence of Cuba. It was just anathema to Joseph Kennedy's whole means of existence, a reason for existence, as his father. And so Jack experienced significant amounts of upset about the existence of Cuba. And he ultimately was enthused enough about it that he convinced his cabinet to vote on invading Cuba. I mean, as it turned out, it was the first ever actual act. I mean, always before we had been a nation which defended itself but never attacked other nations. And that was simply compromise. That went out the window with what came to be known as the Bay of Pigs. That was the landing site for the U.S. forces who were coming in there. And the question that was raised by that were manifold, but the social psychologists got interested in how on earth could such a high-ability group make what turned out to be such a disastrously wrong decision. We should not have invaded Cuba, but it was the cabinet of JFK that created that particular decision. And there were a number of things that were developed out of it. And just by way of getting the Democrats off the hook here, let me suggest that the Republicans, excuse me, screwed up in similar way just a few years later with Richard Nixon, who eventually formed a political group, or a group was formed around him called the Committee to Re-elect the President, labeled CREEP, as it turns out. And CREEP's goal was simply to find dollars. Their whole idea was to get dollars, which would in fact get Richard Nixon re-elected. But there are a number of others that could be mentioned of groupthink. If you've heard of the Manson family and the killing of Sharon Tate out in Hollywood, that's another example of groupthink. The Branch Davidian compound and all the murders that took place there offshore here in the U.S. with an intense group of mothers and children and so forth who were led off to an isolated place where they couldn't escape very easily, and the leader ultimately came to the decision that it was best if everybody sacrificed themselves, killed themselves, and it was ultimately interrupted by landing forces. The U.S. troops got in there and broke it up, but the very idea that some people lost their lives there was ultimately just a function of, or a result of groupthink that was flawed thinking in the decision making. So in any case, what leads to groupthink? Well, there are a number of different symptoms of the likelihood that groupthink will occur. One of them is the illusion of invulnerability. Richard Nixon and his cabinet, particularly the cabinet, had the idea, or CREEP, I should say, simply had the idea that Nixon is right, and as others said, yes, far right. But in any case, the belief, the thing that the idea that held CREEP together was simply the idea that there was no president better for the country in second term than was Richard Nixon at that point, and that's really the power that led it. And the group itself was powerful enough as national leaders and financiers and so forth that they created the illusion for themselves of being invulnerable. We know the truth, and we will share it. We will find the money to share it with the country. And so the illusion of invulnerability leads to groupthink. One of the things that follows out of that is a stereotyped view of the opposition. They're often just captured as evil, all caps. But that's a stereotypic view of the opposition, anybody that doesn't agree with your views. Another that comes out of another illusion on which groupthink is based is the illusion of unanimity. The idea that everyone thinks the same way we do and we know how it should be done. What happens here is that you get a lot of self-censorship of dissenting ideas. people begin to think that, in a group situation where groupthink is building or is actually occurring, people keep the lid on their own ideas because they get surrounded by other people whom they enjoy and respect. And if all of them are arguing in a particular way, even though that person may think it's wrong, they begin to censor themselves in terms of, if everybody else thinks this is right, there must be something wrong with the reason I don't think it's right. And so you get self-censorship. And what's created there is the illusion of unanimity. There may be a number of people sitting in that group situation, analyzing, thinking to themselves the problem with the idea, or any of several problems with the idea, but if nobody verbalizes it, what's created is that illusion of unanimity, that everybody thinks the same. And a third one is, that also tends to happen, is that you get social pressures for conformity in that particular situation. You get people formed who are called mind guards. In the instance of John Kennedy's cabinet, there's been a lot of books written about that over the course of the years. But it turned out that the two people that took over leadership of that cabinet in the way in which it ultimately made a wrong decision to invade Cuba, there were two mind guards, essentially. Then Secretary of State Dean Rusk was one of the two, and the other was the president's brother, Robert Kennedy. The two of them at night, when the cabinet wasn't meeting, oftentimes were on the phone at night talking to other members of the cabinet in order to assure that a uniform decision would come out, that a unanimous decision would come out. And they were using all manner of pressure to do that. But it was essentially pressure directed toward conformity. The boss wants this. Stick with the boss on this. Let's vote with this. It's a good idea. Cuba is a problem to us, and so forth. But it was Dean Rusk and Robert Kennedy who formed that, or served that purpose in the group. They became the mind guards in that situation. And if we look at the factors that are involved, then we have invulnerability, the illusion of invulnerability, the illusion of unanimity, and then the resulting pressure for conformity that results among the people who have most seriously bought into whatever erroneous decision is about to be made. The factors that lead to groupthink are pretty easy to identify, and these would include things like cohesion. The more cohesive a group is, the greater the likelihood that it may get itself into a groupthink situation where a group-based decision produces a wrong result. If they're isolated, if they're not able to solicit opinion from outside sources, to say, to call another colleague and say, we're thinking about, what do you think of this? You'll get those other objections. The presence of a strong assertive leader, and Kennedy certainly was in that situation, particularly when he was aided by both his brother and the then Secretary of State. The triumvirate was a very strong persuasive source leading to that erroneous decision. And also the importance of decision. Of the decision. All of those are factors that may lead groups feeling pressure to make a decision, to essentially make a wrong decision in a given situation. There are a number of means of preventing groupthink, and that's pretty straightforward. It's kind of the reverse of what I was talking about. But number one is get the reactions of neutral outsiders. Get the reactions of people who understand the problem and have no vested interest, pro or con, on what ought to be done in a given, that's a bad choice of words, I hate it when people do that, that should consider what should be done in a given situation, that the sources that you check have no vested interest in what decision will ultimately be made. Another thing is, a good leader will not commit him or herself too early. That is, they will take advantage of that leadership position to pull the opinions of the different members of the group out of the opinions, get them surfaced, so that everybody can know where other people are coming from, what the ideas are that bear on whatever the group is trying to make a decision about. Another is, don't criticize critics. In a group meeting where you're leading toward a policy decision, it is important not to criticize critics. React to the idea, not to the individual. Another idea that's similar to that, different in some ways, but what you can do day by day is to assign one person around the table, you're going to be the critic today. Your goal, as it's understood by the group, is to think orthogonally, think in an opposite way to the way the group itself is thinking, and raise those issues and defend them. Be prepared to defend them. We will not hold it against you. And by group decision, each person is there when they're serving as the critic to serve the role of a critic, to look at what the group is thinking about and raise Cain about it, raise difficult issues. And if the idea is a good one, the answers will be forthcoming. You will get answers to the questions that you're talking about there. You can also use another kind of group process, which is also effective in this situation. That is to break the larger group, the total group, into, say, the president's cabinet, for instance, when they made that wrong decision about invading Cuba. One way to get around that would be to assign, if the cabinet is 40 people, assign 8 groups of 5 or 5 groups of 8, and have each of them debate what they think to be the largest problem that might be encountered, or the biggest danger, or something like that, and report back to the group, where the group is a given person within each of those groups is assigned to write the group's decisions on the board, and it is known in the meeting that the person doing the writing is not necessarily endorsing the idea. They were assigned to be the reporter for that particular group. So personal ownership is simply removed in that situation. Get the issues up. And when you've got 5 different groups instead of one looking at it, the issues will tend to surface. And then the cluster of the entire group can go back through it idea by idea. And again, if it's a good idea, a good decision the group is headed toward, they will be able to come up with arguments for or against any particular situation there. But it's a matter of structuring the group. Have a second meeting after a major decision is made. Another way to do it is have a second meeting. Do you have any afterthoughts? I mean, this is what we've decided to do, and by then it's kind of scoped out. Do you have any afterthoughts? So there are a couple of different ways. That one's a little more risky than dividing people into smaller groups, simply because it's a lot harder to alter something that's already in print or in policy, if we want to think about it that way. But essentially, open yourself up to criticism. Structure the way in which critics are not going to be criticized for playing the role of critics in a given situation. One of the other things you have to be aware of in a group situation is that you steer away from group polarization. This was originally called in the literature risky shift, and it identifies essentially the tendency of groups to take riskier positions than the individuals constituting the group would tend to do. But the result in that situation, when it shifts to an extreme, is that you may end up with what's called group polarization, which is the tendency of a discussion to yield more extreme decisions, whether conservative or risky, than would be made by individuals composing the group on their own. That is, the group can talk themselves into a more extreme position than the individual members happen to believe in a given situation. Why does it occur? It's a fascinating social process that's going on there, but one of the things that's involved is essentially normative influence. And that is simply, what that represents is an alteration of your attitude or opinion that results from determining the major opinion of a group. When you've decided that the group is somehow opposed to what you're in favor of, that can influence your own decision. That will impact your decision making in a given situation. We evaluate ourselves in any situation, but particularly in a group or social situation, by comparing ourselves to others in that group, particularly if it's an important group to us. It becomes the reference group, the one to which we cater. And we're always looking at, how do I fit into this situation? And that the group position will sometimes alter an individual's position in a given situation. When we discover others that think as we do, we tend to shift further in the same direction, typically to a point beyond the group average. Now understand, I'm laying out a couple of different things on you with that kind of statement, but the idea that the polarization occurs partly because each of us as a member of a group is evaluating what the group is going through in a given situation. And as we compare our own opinion against the group opinion, we may shift in the direction of the group, but that in turn means then that our own discussion matter or points tend to shift in that direction also. And pretty soon, whoever's been the last not yet moved member is finding more and more people shifting in the direction of a given decision, and eventually is feeling pressure to be pulled along with them. And thus, that person goes through starting to modify their views and so forth. And so when you're dealing with a complex social group situation, there are a lot of different factors that come into play ultimately, and these forces leading toward polarization are predicated entirely on knowing what the group believes in a given situation. Not why, but what they believe. And this predominates in matters of opinion or of value. That kind of a polarization effect is very likely to occur. The other kind of thing that is pressuring changes in these situations and polarization is informational influence. It depends on knowing why the group thinks as it does. That's a different set of factors. Okay? Others' arguments may persuade us to adopt a more extreme position. And this predominates particularly in matters of fact. So where the normative influence tends to be registered in matters of opinion and value, the informational influence tends to be more directly impactful on matters of fact, where those need to be analyzed in a given situation. The operation of these factors is demonstrated then by showing that altered opinions occur because of hearing what others believe, but not why they believe it, or hearing reasons for a specific belief without knowing how the group feels as a whole. The net effect there is that you've got both the normative influence and the informational influence combining to ultimately shift people in general toward a more extreme view, both as individuals and then ultimately, because of individual action, as a result of the group as a whole. So the next major section that we're going to step into, I will delay until the next lecture to actually start talking about, but that's going to be looking at communication networks, how we link from the previous topic, communication, into this issue of influence. Because it turns out the position you have in a group's communication network has a major impact on how impactful you will be in the group decisions that are ultimately made. We will pick it up next time with influence.